Some plants are generalists and can be pollinated by many species of the same or related taxa. These plants usually offer their reward openly to anyone. A pollinator can just land on the flower, harvest the reward, and fly away without having to do anything special in order to get the reward. The signaling of these flowers is also such that different types of pollinators from the same or different taxonomical families can recognize them and be attracted by them. Other flowers are specialists and can be pollinated by only one or a few similar species of pollinators. In addition to having signaling adapted for the specialist pollinators, these plants also require the pollinators to have a specific feature or learn a specific type of behavior in order to be able to pollinate them. The ghost orchid, for instance, has this long tube in its corolla where it stores the nectar. Only moths that have a long enough serve to reach the nectar will visit the orchid and be able to effectively pollinate it. Originally, it was thought that only the giant sphinx moth, with its enormously long serve, was able to pollinate the ghost orchid. But thanks to photo traps, it was shown that 4 species of moths with long serves are actually available to provide this service for the ghost orchids. Another example of extremely specialized interaction is the deceptive flowers that mimic mating partners. Their signature pheromone scent and appearance are such that they only attract males of one species and no others. Yet another type of specialized flower requires not a specific type of pollinator, but a specific type of behavior called buzz pollination. In buzz pollination, the insects, usually bumblebees, vibrate the flower so that pollen, which is closed in the anther, is released and falls on the pollinator. If the insect has not yet learned this behavior or is not capable of doing it because it is not strong enough, as is the case with bees and fly pollinators, then it will not be able to pollinate the flower. The advantage of specialized pollination is that the mutualistic relation can be highly beneficial, as both the pollinator and the plant have co-evolved to gain maximum rewards from one another. The disadvantage is that if the pollinator is gone, the plant cannot reproduce. And if the plant goes extinct, the pollinator cannot feed. This might be why specialist species are often going extinct. What happens when a specialist species loses its pollinators is demonstrated in this study in New Zealand. The flowers of this shrub are pollinated by 3 bird species. 2 of the species went extinct on the mainland of New Zealand because of predators brought by humans. However, all 3 bird species still coexist on smaller islands of New Zealand. On each location, mainland and small islands, the researchers did 3 pollination treatments. One where they bag the flowers so that they can only self-pollinate. One where the flowers were left intact so that they're open-pollinated and presumably pollinated by birds. And lastly, flowers were hand-pollinated with huge amounts of pollen to make sure that the pollination is efficient and not pollen-limited. The results of the study show clearly how bagged plants that were not in contact with pollinators, whether it is bird or humans, produced very few seeds, suggesting that the species is not capable of autonomous pollination. Open-pollinated flowers, however, showed huge and significant differences between the island and the mainland. On the island, where all 3 pollinator species are present, the fruit set was 3 times as high as open-pollinated flowers on the mainland, where only 1 pollinator species is present. And lastly, hand-pollinated individuals had very high fruit set in both locations, suggesting that there are not fruiting differences between the plants of different locations. Instead, it is the limitation in pollinators' activity between the mainland and the islands that limits the fruit set in the mainland. The pollinator's preference for a certain type of flower is called flower constancy. Flower constancy is measured as the amount of pollen one species of pollinator has harvested. Pollinators that are exclusively specialists have high flower constancy, because they only visit one flower species. Generalist pollinators can feed on many flower species, so they should have low flower constancy. However, measurements show that flower constancy is usually high even in generalist pollinators, going up to 95% of constancy for some species. The measurement of flower constancy showed that it is highest in the genus Apis and Halictrus and the lowest in Anthophora. Flower constancy is obviously beneficial for the flowers that get more reliably pollinated. But what is the benefit of flower constancy for bees? One suggested hypothesis is the limited short-term memory the insects have. Although some pollinators can distinguish up to 700 floral species, when a pollinator is on the fly, it needs to scan about 5 flowers per second. So a pollinator needs to recognize a desirable flower almost instantly. This recognition might be limited by the short-term memory of the pollinators, and therefore the pollinators have developed high flower constancy. Instead of having to memorize several flowers of interest at once, they only focus on one because of short-term memory limitation. However, when researchers tested the short-term memory of pollinators, they saw that pollinators can learn and correctly memorize flowers with good rewards in as little as one training session. Harvesting floral rewards is simple in some flowers that readily offer them to any pollinator which lands on the corolla. In other species, however, the pollinators need to learn complex flower handling techniques in order to access the rewards. Here, a bumblebee needs to pry open the petals of the flower in order to reach inside and access the highly nutritious nectar. It is hypothesized that flower handling techniques learned on one plant species presumably interfere with previously learned techniques for other plant species because of the limited neural capacity of pollinators. Bumblebees with no experience in handling flowers with complex morphology took about 60 to 100 flower encounters before they had fully developed the skill to extract the nectar. Thus, pollen constancy could be saving some time and energy to the pollinators because they do not waste resources in learning how to handle new flowers.